Good afternoon. My name is Susan Cohen, and I am the Associate Vice Chancellor of Alumni Relations here at Washington University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Wednesdays with WashU, featuring art collector and WashU parent Komal Shah. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Washington University Alumni Association and the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts. I am very pleased to share that we have alumni and friends joining us tonight from over 30 states and 5 countries. We have a very special program planned for you this evening. For those of you who have participated in previous Wednesdays with WashU, this one will have a different format and will feature a conversation between Komal Shah and some of our university leaders. They will take questions from the audience at the end of their conversation. You may submit questions in the Q&A box at any time. Please also feel free to utilize the chat function to introduce yourself and let us know where you're viewing from this evening. Just one small reminder, when you do send a chat, please make sure to select panelists and all attendees. It is now my pleasure to ask Washington University Chancellor Andrew D. Martin to introduce our featured guest and panelist. Chancellor Martin, welcome.
Well, thank you, Susan, and good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to introduce tonight's program and welcome our featured guest, Komal Shah. Komal Shah and her husband, McKelvey School of Engineering alumnus and Washington University trustee Gaurav Garg, have been collecting art since 2008, with a focus on contemporary art by women and artists of color. Their collection includes work by Amy Silman, Charlene Van Heil, Jacqueline Humphreys, Laura Owens, Joan Mitchell, Mark Bradford, and Sam Gilliam, and has been ranked among the world's top 200 art collections by Art News. Active in the art world, Komal serves as trustee of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Tate Americas Foundation. Komal and Gaurav sponsor a conversation series called Artists on the Future at Stanford University that focuses on the intersection of art and socio-political issues. Komal earned her undergraduate degree from Gujarat University and master's degrees from Stanford University and the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. She has worked as an engineer and executive for tech companies, including Oracle, Netscape, and Yahoo, and is organizing fundraising campaigns for various nonprofit organizations. Her son, Bijoy, is a freshman at the McKelvey School of Engineering. I am grateful to her for taking the time to be here today. Komal and Gaurav have been great friends to me since my early days of my chancellorship. In fact, on my final trip prior to the pandemic, they hosted a lovely event for my wife, Stephanie, and me, welcoming our WashU community into their beautiful home in California. When I spoke to her about their collection and saw the artwork displayed in their home, I thought what an honor it would be to feature Komal at a WashU event. I'm really thrilled that this day is here, and I look forward to hearing all of the wisdom she has to share. Komal will engage in conversation with 3 of our university leaders, Carmen Colangelo, Sabine Ekman, and Adrian Davis, who I'm now pleased to introduce. Carmen Colangelo is the Ralph G. Nagel Dean of the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts and the E. Desmond Lee Professor for Collaboration in the Arts. Carmen joined Washington University in 2006 as the first dean of the Sam Fox School. Next is Adrian Davis, who holds the appointment as a William M. Van Cleef Professor of Law, Vice Provost, and Founding Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. She holds courtesy appointments in the departments of African and African American Studies, History, Sociology, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, all in Arts and Sciences, and will soon be joining the faculty at the Olin School of Business as well. I helped recruit Adrian to Washington University. She joined us in 2008 and has served as Vice Provost for a decade. Finally is Sabine Ekman. Sabine is the William T. Kemper Director and Chief Curator of the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. She regularly teaches seminars in the Department of Art History and Archaeology and Arts and Sciences. Sabine is a native of Nuremberg, Germany, and is a specialist in 20th and 21st century European art and visual culture with a particular focus on the intersection of art and politics. Carmen, Sabine, Adrian, and Komal, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I'll now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. And I am indeed very grateful to our Chancellor because he is the one who hired me at the law school all those many years ago. So, I'm really excited for this conversation today. Art is one of the most transformative parts of the human experience. And we have certainly seen over the last year a growing interest in how the institutions and markets for art are intersecting with this moment of focusing on how we include underrepresented groups and individuals. Like universities, arts institutions deeply value and also struggle at the same time with these questions. And collectors like Kamal model ambitious and vibrant ways to think about art collecting, and how we engage with arts institutions. So I'm going to ask my colleague Sabine Ekman to tell us a little bit more about why this moment is so important.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you for the introduction, Chancellor Martin, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging in this really important conversation. I will try to be brief. It is really such an important topic that we could spend the entire time contextualizing and historicizing of why it is so important to present underrepresented artists. Let me be brief. In 1971, exactly 50 years ago, the important American art historian Linda Nochlin asked, "Why have there been no great women artists?" Although her seminal essay, which focused on institutional barriers experienced by women artists, had an enormous influence on feminist art history and theory, her inquiry remains as relevant and acute today as it was half a century ago. More recently, in 2002, Okwe Envisor, by decentering European and American art in his Documenta 11 exhibition, that for the very first time was conceived by a non-European Black curator, foregrounded a post-colonial perspective. It assembled art on a global scale, highlighting many artists from marginalized communities and geographies. His last exhibition, finalized after his premature death in 2019, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, opened several weeks ago at New York's New Museum, and exhibits the work of 37 Black American artists that visualize mourning and loss in response to incomprehensible racist violence across the United States. It is seen as Envisor's most political exhibition and includes such artists as Mark Bradford, Arthur Jafa, Kevin Beasley, Charles Gaines, and Julie Merithu, many of which are also included in Comal's collection. This short legacy that nevertheless reaches back half a century underscores, I believe, the important project to collect and exhibit artists from diverse and underrepresented geographical, social and political backgrounds, exemplifying a vast array of very different subject positions excluded for centuries from the official art world. I think and hope that Kamal will agree with us that this equitable visibility and emphasis on peripheries will continue to fundamentally change our understanding and knowledge about human creativity. It will amplify how artworks may act as powerful agents for social and political change as they confront us with alternatives that transgress borders and long-established boundaries. And with that introduction, which is very, very important, I will give the word back to Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you. That was, I think, very helpful background for all of us. So Kamal, can you tell us how, when, and maybe why you began collecting? And I always love to know, what was your inaugural purchase?
So first of all, thank you so much for including me in today's conversation. It has been such a warm welcome, so thank you again. You know, I'll start a little bit sort of before I started collecting with my life journey, which is I came to the US about 30 years ago to study computer science. And, you know, really enjoyed the ride, worked in several great companies, helped build great products. And then around 2008, I decided to take time off work because we had 2 children and they needed attention. And as a mother, it became clear to me that I really needed to be at home for them. And so as I started sort of stepping off, several of my friends in the community started asking me to get more engaged in art and something that was perceived to be more flexible in terms of time. And I became a trustee at the Asian Art Museum. And I was supposed to be brought in as a community leader to focus on the Indian sort of cultural movement. And I want to add vibrancy. However, I discovered that sort of the Indian cultural innovations, unfortunately, for the Asian Art Museum at that point in time meant yoga and Maharaja and sort of the exoticism of India was their focus. However, I was much more interested in the cultural vibrancy in the arts at that point. And I felt a little bit of an odd duck because, I have lived in this country for way more than half my life. And I feel that I'm a global citizen. And in some ways, I connected a lot more with artists who were perhaps based in North America and in Europe as well. So I sort of wanted a new filter. And that's when I was invited by several of my friends at the Tate to go on an art tour in New York. We saw the Whitney Biennial. We saw two artists, Charlene Von Heil and Jacqueline Humphreys, that I'll talk about later. But that's somehow for me, that was that moment when love happened. That kind of crazy love where you just have to have it. And until then, I have certainly visited, I would say, hundreds of museums, if not more. Gaurav and I both, even when we were in, I think a month after we got married in '99, we were in New York and fell in love with a painter we didn't know much about. And he was Willem de Kooning, but they were his late paintings and we absolutely fell in love with them. But after hearing that the prices were 200,000, we said, oh my God, we can't afford that. And of course, the prices have since multiplied only 200 times. But that being said, I decided to go to one of the art auctions with some of my friends who have been my mentors. And there was this beautiful work by Reena Banerjee that you see on the slide. And I had told my friend Dipti that I wasn't going to bid for it since I was too new to just even really thinking about art. But something just flipped in my head. And I had to ask my friend to raise the paddle for this work of art. And I don't think there was a real sort of thoughtful path to getting to the first artwork. Though I think after that, it's been a combination of sort of serendipity as well as deliberate collecting. So this work by Reena Banerjee is one of my absolute favorites even now.
Thank you. And it is stunning.
Yeah.
It is stunning. So I want to follow up. Your collection is, as we've been saying, of predominantly paintings by women artists and artists of color is very renowned and it's distinguished, yet it's also very intentional. I want to ask you two questions, which you can say are the same question if you want. What are some of the most important works in your collection? And what are some of the most meaningful works in your collection? And maybe you can tell me that those two things are the same, but maybe they're different.
So I will say that, my initial foray into collecting wasn't really a calculated one in terms of what direction I was going to have, or that I even needed an overarching story or a direction to the collection. And it was more about having that visceral reaction to the works of art and understanding, with the help of several great curators that are my mentors, what was the underlying story or the uniqueness of the work, or why it was an important work, or why the artist had something interesting to say. And at that point, I realized that some of the core works that I now consider core were works by women, my generation, so between 40 and 60, and they were dealing with abstraction in new inventive ways, and that sort of then and that sort of really became the foundation of my collecting, unbeknownst to me that there were these common threads. And I want to take you through some of the works, and then we can talk about, sort of what it has become, what the collection has become now. But I just mentioned Charlene Wunheil, German artist, grew up with all the boys in Cologne. Jorgi Mendorf, Albert Olin were sort of her friends, mentors. She worked as an apprentice. However, she has staked out her own language as far as abstraction is concerned. There are recurring motifs, she paints sometimes from behind, from the front, but each work is very unique. Each work is very forceful. And sometimes, you're trying to decipher stories, and sometimes there aren't, and sometimes there aren't. However, she has a very powerful hand as far as painting is concerned. Go to the next. And I'll just go through these more quickly, just so that we have some time for questions. Jacqueline Humphreys is part of our core group as well. And her painting is the one behind me right now. She is one of these, again, artists in her late 50s working on abstraction, but it's sort of the next generation of abstraction. So with this painting in particular, Gaurav and I had gone to her studio, and she said, well, I have found this laser cutter and I'm going to town with it. This is going to be my form of mark making. She uses silver paint because she loves silver as a way of reacting to different lights at different points in time in different ways, right? So the painting never looks the same. She talks about the silver as also being part of our silver screens that we are so looking at all the time now. And finally, sort of the mark makings are actually emojis. And one of the stories behind it is that she communicates with her brother, who is autistic, through emojis. And so there are all these layers combined, but at the end of the day, both Gaurav and I just looked at it and said, oh my God, this is a beautiful painting. And you get that sort of reaction to this work when you look at it. Next painting. Now, this actually does have a funny story, so I'm going to weave in some stories here. This was a very early purchase and actually bought on the auction market. From the auction catalog, there was a little thumbnail, and I thought it looked like a very beautiful landscape painting. And I have, of course, admired Amy Sylvan, so, ended up acquiring this work. And when Gaurav got home and I mentioned that I'd acquired this work, he said, oh, so what's the title? And I didn't quite know what the title was, and so I had to look it up. And it turns out it's A Little Threesome. And I'm sure it's all adults in this conversation, but from that point on, the penis has been the most visible part of the painting because there are 3 figures in this work. It's just that I hadn't quite decoded that at that point in time. Next artwork. Laura Owens is also, I would consider, part of the core group. She's exactly my age. In terms of what she is doing here, it's a motif of a needlepoint that her grandmother had made that has now been blown up into collages, into silk screening, and these are like 50 layers of silk screening. And then in a very Duchampian way, she sort of, sometimes will add everyday objects like a bicycle wheel onto the work of art. And then she actually ends up painting on that bicycle wheel. And sort of there are all these interesting elements that go back and forth with a very old school motif. I mean, we can talk about pattern and decoration now, that's becoming more mainstream, but before then, this was a very radical move to make. Yet it's very fresh, abstraction has never looked like this before. And the painting itself is just really stunning visually. Next. Okay, so here's where there's a bit of a sort of a change in my collecting journey, that I ended up meeting with many of these artists. And with some, I can even say that I've become friends with them. They're all spunky, super intelligent, very creative. women, and we all became friends. But as I started diving deeper into their work and into their lives, and noticing who else was joining them at various openings, I realized that there was a whole history of women that had gone before them that are still alive, but that have made a lot of roadways or into this sort of collecting, into the artistic journeys. And Linda Benglis, Mary Heilman are some of the ones that are now in their 80s, but have been painting in a very feminist way, if you will, for a while. And Linda Benglis is again one of those stalwarts from that feminist moment where she said, why can't women paint like Pollock? And however, she didn't just do Pollock. She said she was going to paint on the floor using polyurethane. And then that is the painting, and it stays on the floor. It doesn't get hung up on a wall. And, it by the way, it's a cerebral, but it's a really beautiful work. And this was sort of her first series of works that I think really questioned, what women can do that men can. And let's keep going, otherwise I'll sort of keep talking away. And then Elizabeth Murray is one of the other women who I've absolutely admired. She died early. But, one of the things I thought about this work was, when I looked at it initially, was, oh, it's a beautiful abstract painting. However, Roberta Smith, the famous critic, New York Times critic, had come over to look at the work and talk more about it. It turns out it has 14 panels of wood that are juxtaposed in I still haven't figured out, after owning the work for many years, how the wood gets turned, the canvas is turned. And there are these 14 panels that, have a very muscular characteristic, but it's very powerful. It's called Joanne in the Canyon. It's actually about her friend Joanne, who is a Philharmonic orchestra conductor. And then you start seeing the feet on the ground, the musical notes for her fingers. You see an Empire State Building, which Joanne loved, but she has been a huge influence on so many artists today. So I thought that it would be important to include her work in this discussion.
These are stunning. These are stunning.
Yeah, beautiful.
If something stops my heart, this is the one. So Joan Mitchell is, of course, a very well-known artist. Why this painting stops my heart amongst all is that this was her last painting. And she made this painting in 1992, knowing that she was going to New York. She lived in Paris, and she knew she was going to New York to get her final chemotherapy treatment. She had lung cancer. And so this painting has been described as her last hero painting. And it is joyful and vibrant and powerful. She has used every color in her playbook, the magentas. It's hard to see, but on top, there are these shades of white mixed in with purples and yellows. And it isn't called that, but it is actually the sunflowers. And there's been a lot of research now done on this painting because there's an upcoming retrospective on her. But so this work has usually been the bookend of all the shows. And when I look at this work, it ties in so well to our collection because it's really about contemporary painting. It's about women today, but she is the most influential artist for most of the women in our collection. And so having her last painting be the cornerstone of our collection made a lot of sense. Next painting. So Firale Baez is on the younger side. I think she is one of those upcoming, rising, amazing artists. So again, just going by the whole visual aesthetic, this painting, when I saw a very tiny image, won me over. But as I peeled through the layers, I realized that behind the painted layers is the blueprint of the women's hospital in New Orleans. And this was the only women's hospital that was for Black women. And so Katrina wiped out this last place of shelter for Black women in New Orleans. And so while it looks like a very beautiful, pastel-y mix of colors, Easter painting, it's actually about the plight of women, about what happened. And, one of the things that Firole said to me was that, did you know that women in those times were not given anesthesia because Black women knew no pain? And it's not an up and up painting, but it has a lot of poignancy and sadness to it as well. Next painting. So I know Mark Bradford was mentioned with the Grief and Grievance show, and that show, by the way, is spectacular. I just saw it a couple of weeks ago. This painting in particular is about the Tulsa riots that happened, as we all know, a long time ago, where there were mass burials, lynching, and the whole incident was wiped out from history books until 2001. And Mark Bradford and his sort of, his language of social abstraction really did an amazing job depicting blood on the streets, the scabs. And this was actually one of the first moments. This was in a show at the Hammer Museum at UCLA, but this was the first moment where he actually refined his language to really create these scabs in a very three-dimensional way, where you literally see streets burning, you see blood. And I will say that for a while, it was very hard for me to agree to acquire this work because it is very strong. And it arouses a lot of feelings of anger, sort of reactions to unfairness. And however, the way a curator explained it to me that, if you're going to buy anything about social abstraction, you have to buy what Mark Bradford stands for. And so this painting entered our collection because of the rationale there. But I will also say that, again, when you look at it, it's just an incredibly immersive work of art. Next one. And I know Kevin Beasley was also mentioned. Kevin is, again, on the younger side, Yale MFA, etc. But what he's dealing with in a very interesting and different way is dealing with the ghosts of his ancestors. And these are house dresses and kaftans that his mother, his grandmother, his aunts used to wear, that he has now cast in resin in terms of preserving memories. And one of the interventions or the new directions that happened was he had a show at the Whitney about 2 years ago. And he started to think about, the fact that there was cotton slavery, sort of slavery related to cotton trade involved with how the Whitneys made their fortune. And so he was also raised in a cotton farm. And what he decided to do for this new body of works was to actually bring in the cotton from his farms to talk about slavery and to talk about sort of the social conditions from there on to now. However, it looks like a very beautiful landscape. And in terms of color mixing, I think it's a very strong work of art. Next slide. And Katharina Grosse happens to be an artist that Sabine is actually looking at quite deeply. But she is, in some ways, she's actually more part of the core collection. I just wanted to pull out this last slide here because I know Sabine, there's a special WashU Sabine connection happening. However, I love the way she brings nature, she brings the intervention of what's outside and inside and mixes the two. Again, in a very beautiful way, but there's a lot of intellectual depth behind the work. So I think that's it for the slideshow, and we could keep talking.
Well, I'm going to invite both Carmen and Sabina to each ask a question, and then we'll go to some engagement with the audience. We've got some pre-submitted questions also at about 5:45.
Sabina?
you want to go ahead, Carmen?
Sure, I will. Thanks, Kamal. It's amazing to see your collection and the work. And I'm wonder, as the artist in the group, if you could tell me a little bit about the relationship you have with the artists and how much time you spent with them, either in their studios, because you seem so interested in the surface of the work, and yet at sometimes it looks like you've acquired the works without seeing it in person. So I wonder what your relationship is to the artists in terms of your thinking about collecting and how you're drawn into the process of their work.
So I have learned that it's very important for me to know the artists. And, the common wisdom sometimes is to not get to know the artist, but to really just focus on the art. Because sometimes, your reactions to an artist's journey or an artist himself or herself can temper, the works. I will say that in terms of what enters in our collection, it is really about the work. The first rule being the visceral reaction, but the second and the third being, why is it unique, etc. However, I will say that my career in technology has been in product management, which is really around creating new products. And, so it is sort of really at the cusp of creativity and engineering. However, I call it creativity with sort of limits, right? You're trying to figure out what the customer wants and you're trying to sort of make a match happen there. In the art world, what actually stimulates me is that it is unbound creativity. And when I go to artist studios and listen to them talk about, what they're thinking and why they're sort of thinking of it in different ways or what they're creating, I feel like I walk on water for at least a week after. And, when I sometimes will just sit, fly on the wall at different artist studios. And that's what I did with Laura Owens, where, there were all these people putting together 50 layers of silk screening. And it was fascinating to watch the process, but it's also just amazing to see the creativity that's actually happening in the moment. Meeting some of these artists actually made me also realize that the level field is not even for women. And as I've gotten to know more and more of them, I've realized that, the odds are just stacked against women and against artists of color. And, in the 60s and 70s, the Whitney had a big show on Black masculinity. Thelma Golden was at the Whitney. In the 70s, there was a lot of work done around women and feminism. And, there was just a lot of strength in those 70s years around the time that Linda Nochlin wrote her essay. However, things sort of, just fall off the radar. And then you look at the auction records, you look at what's collected in museums, and it's men. And I think that sort of really fueled our desire to shine a light on marginalized artists and to really redesign this canon of art with equal stature afforded to all because of their skills and not because of their gender or their race.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to hear that, all of that. Thank you.
Really fascinating presentation, Komal. I think I want to bring it back to a question which is institutionally just very important to me. You are very much involved also with Stanford and other educational institutions, and obviously representing here also the voice of a university museum. And so I was wondering, do you think that universities, and specifically also university museums, have opportunities to educate through art that are really distinct and different from public museums?
Absolutely. And I think that the onus on university museums is even higher to really bring about, to be morally right and to shine a light on that path that is morally right. I would hope and pray that university museums are not as fettered with commercial success and necessarily having to do a Warhol show, which has happened in some of the museums I work closely with, but that they can actually focus on writing that balance. There was a survey done by ArtNet last year. Last year was the centennial of the suffrage movement, and there was a lot expected to happen for women in 2020, but COVID took precedence over that. However, if you look at museums, only 12% of the works that are collected by museums today are by women. And this accounts for 51% of the women in the world, right? Or 51% of the population in the world. And I think that, we've long sort of played the game of, white males and collecting white males and white males doing really well. I think that for university museums, it is really important to find greatness amongst the marginalized sections of the art community. And also to really think about, what is art? How does it tell the right stories? At some point, you are grooming the citizens of tomorrow, and you have to feed them the right stories and show them the right things as well. And I use the word right in a very judgmental way, but I do want to make sure that as university museums, I do feel that it's important to have a sense of sort of right and wrong, and to actually stake a claim there, and put a foot forward. I'm on the search committee of the Cantor Art Museum at Stanford, and one of the things we've been talking about is, how does this museum become a place of vibrancy and bring communities together, right? And I think that that's also something that a university museum can do really well at, sort of both education, but also bringing people together. And I think that those are sometimes not exactly part of some of the other museums, the larger museums.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. And we have some questions that were pre-submitted, and we already also have some questions coming in from folks who are on now. So I'm going to start with one of the pre-submitted questions, which is about advice for collectors. And it's kind of a two-part question. First, do you have any advice for new collectors? What should they keep in mind when collecting their first inaugural piece? And then second, how do you get started with a limited budget in collecting?
So first and foremost, you have to buy what you love. I sometimes get asked if I buy works for investment purposes or because I know that it's going to go up. And I feel like, no one knows exactly how things will evolve in the art market. There are some works in our collection that I can't afford anymore. However, that wasn't sort of the design. And I think that it's really important to acquire works that give you joy, that make you think, that move you in interesting ways. And to sort of follow your heart and then eventually bring in your mind as well into collecting. I think for me, one of the points that happened around sort of my thinking about turning 50 was, what's my legacy? How can I make things better? And that's when, for me, it became even more clear that, if I'm going to focus my time, my money, and my passion onto this effort, it needs to be meaningful. It really needs to be about shining a light on an underserved community. And that sort of became our mission for the collection. So it's a very mission-driven collection now. It wasn't at the beginning, for sure. And, there were, it meandered for a few years, and that's okay. As long as you love the work, I think that's what matters most. I think as far as budget is concerned, it doesn't matter in terms of the budget. My general advice is to go look at as much art as you can. And that's really what will give you a sense of what brings you joy. Where do you find that connection that excites you? There are lots of art fairs. There haven't been as many, but art fairs, visiting art galleries, museums are all great places to go. I look at Art 21 a lot. That's the PBS videos on artists and works of art for education. I speak a lot with two of my favorite curators who are my mentors in this collecting journey, Mark Godfrey from the Tate and Gary Gerrels, who used to be at SF MoMA. And I learn a lot from them. I mean, I'm constantly asking them lots of questions, and they have so much information that it's just a wonderful match and lets me get away without having an MFA or a bachelor's in art history, but just knowing enough to be dangerous.
And if I may, I want to just kind of reinforce what Kamal was just saying, and you look at work that is completely outside of your budget, because that will inspire you. Looking is free, and it'll inspire you and help you decide what you love. And I'll sort of say this, Kamal and I have some shared works in our collection, but they're at very different price points, and so a lot of the artists, they make pieces, they're makers across price points. So I think that we should always look at what we love and not think about price first. So stemming from what you were just saying, talking about kind of the mission of the collection, which is a family mission, and also continuing with our discussion about underrepresentation, I've got two questions that have come in from folks today. So the first one is, in addition to seeking out women and artists of color, do you also intentionally work with minority-owned or women-owned galleries and minority-led arts organizations? I mean, do you see, and they continue to say, do you see your collection as being able to have an impact on bringing equity into the business side of the art world?
So, it's a very good question, and I don't have the answer because I need to think about the answer, but I would say that at least half of the galleries we work with are women-run. I also have this slight tendency to work with galleries that are smaller. I tend to not work with large galleries. I have nothing against Gagosian, but I have never bought a work of art from them. And I sometimes feel that once it gets to that point, I can go and look at when it gets to the point of a work of an artist being represented by Gagosian, I can go look at other artists that might need more help. And so, there's always the desire to support the underdog. And I think that beyond that, I can't say that I really focus on seeking out those dealers, because sometimes, I think it's much more at this point about the artists and about supporting them. I will say that one of the things that I'm proud of is that at Stanford, when we have this artist series, we've had about 5 artists so far speak. Lorna Simpson, Linda Benglis, Dana Schutz, Injadeka Crosby, and Shirin Nishat have been the 5 speakers. They've been interviewed 4 of them were interviewed by very powerful men. So Darren Walker came to Stanford to interview Hamza Walker. My point being that the series is not ever advertised as a women speaker series. However, all the artists are and will continue to be women. And to me, just sometimes doing that sort of not really naming things as women only does more justice, because at the end of the day, we all want to be seen in an equalized world, not in a segregated fashion.
So going back to your point, you talked a little bit really intriguingly about the mission of the collection. So one of the audience members asked, does your family connect with the works that you choose as much as you do?
I know my husband's watching, so I'll have to be correct. He mostly gets it, but sometimes thinks I'm crazy. My children, however, think I'm very crazy. And, what did you buy? And sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. However, I will say that, once in a math project, our daughter was supposed to create some work of art showcasing integration. She picked a work of Sarah Morris, which was in our family room, to showcase the area under the curve. And I thought that was very creative. My point being that there is a bit of brainwashing that's happening here in terms of them actually assimilating art. And I do feel that over time, they will actually become avid supporters. But, at this point, they're teenagers. Anything mom does is, uncool. So they haven't quite connected with the art yet.
I have a couple of combined questions here. I think we're also compelled by the images that you showed us, and we're trying to get a sense of the scale of some of the pieces. So where is all of your collection displayed? What percentage of your collection is hanging in your home? How often do you rotate it?
Okay, my husband should not know about this. Gaurav, turn off the speakers and the microphones. I would say that about a third of the work is in the house. About 15% of the work, again, changes, is usually out for loans to museums. I tend to like works with large scale that have historical importance. And so, there's only so many works that I can put together in a house, which is very large. Thank God for that. But the rest is in storage. And do I rotate? I do rotate from time to time, but it varies. I don't think I have a set process for it.
And, I thought we might go back, there was some questions coming in about COVID, and I think Sabine and Carmen had some thoughts about that. Did one of you want to ask the question about COVID and collecting?
Sure. I think it was Carmen's question,
I
but it was.
I did wonder about during the pandemic, and of course the change over to virtual art, but I actually wanted to frame the question a little bit differently because of your background in computer science and tech, because now there's also crypto art and there's a movement towards this. And I don't know that it's largely understood even really what that is and how it's accessed. But given your background, I think it's a unique question for you, what the future might be, both about collecting virtually and also how crypto art might play into, in your mind, into the future.
Sure. So I will say that I've continued my pace of collecting over COVID. And I think partly because it's just addictive. But secondly, if there are artists that I already know about, it is possible to get a real sense of what the work might be, even though you're looking at it online. And, there are all these, VR apps that sort of help with that experience. And, it does go halfway, but there's nothing that beats the experience of viewing a painting in person. And I think that that's always going to be the case. There's nothing that's going to really replicate it. But I do think that commerce can still happen. I think that, like the Zoom, I love listening to the varied conversations that artists have been doing with various museums and other institutions. And that has been fabulous. I think that we have a lot more of sort of the intellectual capacity around art open up to everyone. I mean, our Stanford talk used to have about 400 attendees on campus. Now we get 7,000 views. And so I think art has become a lot more accessible with COVID than it used to be. And I'm grateful for, and I'm hoping that will continue, regardless of COVID, right? I went to New York about 2.5 weeks ago, feeling, super womanish. I guess I was done with my vaccinations. And that experience was just heavenly, to actually see all the art in person. I didn't get to meet any artists, but just to see the art was really wonderful. And I don't think that experience can be substituted, really. Crypto and NFTs, I actually don't have much to say. I'm still somewhat skeptical. And there's a part of me, a purist part of me, that hates to think of art as an asset class. And I think that, the authenticity, perhaps maybe giving royalties back to the artist, there are some parts of it that could actually be really great and be really fair and useful. But beyond that, I think when it starts getting inflammatory and crazy and You see all these, announcements of people's work selling for $70 million. To me, it's just insanity.
Mhm.
And so I'm hoping that we get some more sanity in the next few years.
Great, thanks for sharing that. That's great to hear your thoughts on
I
it.
have one more question, but first I want to see if Sabine wants to ask one more question, and then I'll wrap it up with one more question from the audience.
Perfect. Yes, I do have one more question, which I wanted to ask earlier, but then we were running out of time. So when you talked, which really interests me a lot, when you talked in the beginning, of how you were drawn to abstract painting. You were also talking, about the visceral quality of abstract painting and how it sort of immerses you. But at the very same time, abstract painting is also intellectually the most challenging art form, I believe. And so I'm just wondering of how you bring these two together, or why you were drawn really to one of the most complicated art forms possible.
You're absolutely right. And I think that initially it was a love affair with abstract painting, partly because some of the artists Gaurav and I both love are Kandinsky and Rothko and de Kooning, and that sort of really is where our heart is. And so there was sort of this aesthetic connection, this visceral connection to abstract art. But I think for us, the collection now focuses on, are they reinventing abstraction or are they telling other stories? I also find that abstraction lets people bring in their own perspectives and their own stories and their own backgrounds into the work of art, right? It's a unique dialogue depending on the viewer. And to me, I can linger at a painting, a Charlene painting, for hours, because there's always something new I will discover at some corner, or a shape that I might discover. And so it's sort of this never-ending puzzle, and that sort of that escapes being resolved at any point in time. And I really like that intellectual quality of it. I will also say that one of my motivations around abstraction is to really make the paintings divorced of gender or race. One of the things that I see at our home is that people look at the works, walk through the collection and love it. And then they realize that it's a collection of works by 50% women and other men of color. And that's when that switch goes on. But the works themselves are ungendered. They are, not about any specific country, any specific race, etc. And I think that for my purpose, in terms of really leveling the playing field, abstraction helps me achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So Kamal, I want to ask you, I'm going to try to combine two questions. So one question is about, from the, they're both from the collector perspective. So first, from the maybe emerging collector perspective, is it acceptable to negotiate price with artists and galleries, and how to approach that? And then maybe from the other side, how can artists find audiences with collectors, especially artists maybe who are not yet working with galleries?
So one of the things I'm learning is that universities are actually the best places to go look. Students, open houses. So I will say that the Yale MFA program has been raided over too many times, right? But I feel that there are lots of gems in different parts of the country. And, I'm sure that WashU has the same. And I think that that's always a great point to start. There are also local sort of open houses and open studios that I actually have started frequenting, because it's just great places to see sort of what's happening and, see what you might fall in love with. And many of those don't have any gallery representations. And, when you actually become sort of the first transactor for some of the artists, it feels great, actually. It's a different high, and I would encourage that.
I want to reinforce that by saying that I try to regularly go to the Sam Fox MFA show and have been absolutely delighted to see some of the artists that I've bought at MFA shows later end up very quickly on the walls of museums. It is a Carmen, do you want to, kind of wrap us up here?
And that was great, Kamal, in every way possible. And this could go on for a while. And I also put the MFA link in the chat box for when you visit. I'll be happy to show you both MFA exhibitions. The students will love that. This has been really, again, fascinating. Thanks, Adrienne Davis. Thanks, Sabine Ekman, and of course, Kamal Shah for this amazing and illuminating discussion about collecting. It's really fascinating to get a glimpse into your collection, but also into your process. And it's really inspiring, especially, I think, to understand the way that and the complexity that you think about art and how you champion women and artists of color. It's really something that's inspiring, I think, to all of us in this group. And so thank you so much for that, for your leadership in the larger sense of the art world, if you want to use that phrase. I'd like to thank again Adrienne Davis for moderating this discussion, as she always does. She does an exemplary job. She's a great leader at Washington University and has actually done a lot to, for St. Louis at large in terms of for the art world and championing many of the similar themes.
And she has a wonderful art collection in her home.
She has a wonderful art collection. So you're all invited post-COVID to go to Adrienne's house. So on behalf of the Sam Fox School and the Alumni Association, I'd like to thank all of you who have joined us. Your questions have been phenomenal, and I can see the appreciation that you have for this particular event. And I also want to thank Susan Cohen for putting this together, and of course, Chancellor Andrew Martin for hosting us tonight. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great evening. Thanks, Kamal.
Thank you.
Thank you.